We can see your slides.
Okay, perfect. Can you hear me also?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Nikpatchwe Inashwinisha Nisipnak Nawitla, Jerimiah Bonifer. Good afternoon. My name is Jerimiah Bonifer. I'm Assistant Project Lead with the Umatilla Basin Monitoring and Evaluation Project here within the Umatilla Basin in the DNR Fisheries Program. Thank you for inviting me to talk here today. I hope I can lend something to the climate change discussion. I'm going to be talking about climate change impacts to salmonid distribution and survival, specifically within the Umatilla Basin. See if I can get this to move on. There we go. So Gary already touched on the Fisheries Program mission statement and the Umatilla River Vision. I wanted to briefly touch on how we tie into that. And so the Monitoring and Evaluation Project's mission is to generate knowledge regarding the biological performance and ecology of aquatic species of the first foods order in a scientifically credible and policy relevant manner to inform management and policy decisions. So we're monitoring and evaluating, collecting data, performing analyses so that we can help inform some of our management and policy decisions. Real quick, this is a look at the Umatilla River Basin. We can see where the reservation boundary falls into that right now. It encompasses multiple drainages and of course the Umatilla River from the headwaters of the North Fork Umatilla down to its confluence at the Columbia River in the town of Umatilla. So generally when we're talking about salmonids and aquatic first foods, we're talking about water. So I just wanted to touch really quick on the hydrological modeling that Scott O'Daniel presented in the last webinar series. And what that's predicting for us in the Umatilla Basin is we're going to see higher and earlier winter flows. We're going to see those atmospheric rivers, those real big rainstorms like we got this past February, increasing in intensity and frequency. We're going to see higher high flows and lower low flows in the river, and those can impact sedimentation, as like you can see at a Shaplish Canyon right here where it's real muddy, and it can also create higher water temperatures or lower water temperatures in the winter time. We're going to see the Umatilla River Basin transition from a snow-based to a rain-based watershed. So we're going to see less of our precipitation falling as snow where it gets released slowly and over a longer period of time into our river, and more of a rain-based where that precipitation's coming down and moving right out of the basin. So some potential impacts to the Umatilla River aquatic first foods is, like I was saying, with the hydrological model, we're going to see increased summer water temperatures, likely to see a loss of marginal habitat and a shrinking of suitable habitat. Scour events that could lead to red destruction. We had those big floods last year. The timing of those floods coincide with summer steelhead spawning. And when we get those big scour events, we can assume that we're losing some of those reds. Reduced harvest opportunities, either from poor river conditions or low anadromous returns. Poor river conditions, if we've got these consistent high flows or extremely low flows at those times when we're out there trying to harvest first foods, those could really impact our opportunities. Temperature-dependent incubation and emergence disruption. So when our salmon and steelhead and resident fish spawn, the time that those eggs are in incubation to the time that they emerge as fry is temperature dependent. And if we see a disruption in that, we could see a disruption in the out-migration of those smolts and the ocean entry of those juveniles, which can severely impact the survival. Increases in sedimentation could reduce egg survival and later foraging efficacy. So we could see the possibility that some of our reds get smothered with all the sediment that comes out. And then most of our fish here in the Umatilla River Basin are sight feeders. And if we've got real turbid, real dirty, silty water, they're going to struggle to find food. And then also we're going to see decreased monitoring and observation opportunities. And what I mean by that is when we've got conditions where we can't go out and monitor our resources, we're really lowering our ability to adaptively manage and report on those resources and find ways to manage those so that they continue. Get more specific into potential impacts from increasing water temperatures and spring Chinook. We could see increases in pre-spawn mortality as adults. Pre-spawn mortality is where we see those returning adults expiring or dying before they have a chance to spawn and contribute to that next generation. We're likely to see a loss of cold water refugia, areas where our anadromous fish or our resident fish can go to escape those warmer waters. Changes in spawning distribution, the available suitable habitat for spawning to actually take place. We could see changes in food web dynamics. As water's warm, we know that we've got populations of invasive warm water species in the lower river, and if their range expands further upriver into warmer waters where they're finding more suitable habitat, we could see a direct impact on our food web dynamics. We could see changes in our trap and haul operations. If we're having to trap and haul more fish, and depending on where we've got to trap and haul them to, we could see some impacts to harvest opportunities. Again, harvest opportunities either from poor river conditions, poor fishing opportunities, or just simply the quality of those fish. We could see those first food qualities go down as we have warmer water temperatures. We see the condition and the food quality of those first foods go down. So as a more solid example of how water temperature and pre-spawn mortality go together, lower flows, especially low summer flows, generally mean high water temperatures. Spring Chinook generally begin to experience temperature-induced stress around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we see here, this was from a presentation in 2006 of the Umatilla Basin, River Basin, but it still holds very true today. If we look at the the x-axis, this is our water temperatures, and the y-axis is the percentage of that run that die prematurely. They die before spawning. If we look at the 20 degree Celsius where that line intersects, we're seeing roughly 20% of that run die prematurely. If we just go up 5 more degrees Celsius, we see nearly over 50% of our returning adult runs dying prematurely before they're able to contribute to that next generation. That's a pretty large proportion, and it's pretty sad when you consider what these fish have gone through in order to come back. Talking a little more on high temperatures and some of the impacts we see. These are July temperatures, average daily temperatures at a temperature logger site that we have just above Ryan Creek. And if for those of you that might not be familiar where Ryan Creek is, it's in the upper Umatilla River, just above Fred Gray Bridge or down below Elephant Rock, kind of that area. And what I did is I took a look at our temperature data that we had there from 2008 to 2018, and knowing that 64 degrees Fahrenheit is kind of that lower limit where we start to see stress and impacts to spring Chinook, I wanted to look to see how many days in the month of July that we saw an average temperature of 64 degrees or higher. And the slash line or the dotted line moving up there, that's the trend line. And so that's showing from 2008 to 2018 at this site, we're seeing a general increase in the number of days where that temperature is at or above for a whole day. This area in particular is important because we kind of consider this the lower end, that Fred Gray, Ryan Creek area. In the early summer, we really like to see our spring Chinook get past that point because above that is our cold water refugia or our sanctuary area for spring Chinook within the Umatilla Basin. So going to that same area, I took a look at the red distribution within that area for that same time period. And so we have reaches 24, 25, and 26, and these are survey reaches where we go out and perform red observations. And 24 is that lower reach. It would be that Fred Gray up a little ways, and then reach 25 would be about 3.5 miles above Fred Gray Bridge up to Bar M, and then Reach 26 is from Bar M up to the confluence of the North Fork Umatilla River. And what we see over that same time period where those average temperatures were increasing, or those days where those average temperatures were 64 degrees or higher, we see a change in the distribution of our reds. We see that in that lower reach, there's a lower percentage of reds being observed there and a higher percent in the upper reaches. When we see those temperatures going up, this is something we would definitely expect to see, that they're no longer wanting to use that lower reach. It's becoming less suitable, less desirable. And effectively, what we're seeing in this chart is we're seeing a loss of suitable habitat that's becoming marginal habitat, or we could be seeing marginal habitat that's becoming unsuitable.
5-minute warning.
Thank you. So just to get another visual of that, this is the spawning red distribution for the years 2008 to 2019 within the Umatilla Basin. And a particular note on this image that I'd like you to look at is the lower range of the distribution on the main stem Umatilla. You see the bottom end of that range falls in with Moonshine Creek. And then looking in Meacham Creek, we've got a fairly good distribution all the way up to North Fork Meacham Creek. As we go forward into 2014, I didn't show 2009 through 2013 because we see a similar distribution to this. We see that not much has really changed. We're doing okay. And then we go into 2015. Now in 2015, we see a big loss of that distribution, especially at that lower range in the Umatilla River. The important thing to note about this 2015 image is that this was a drought year. So we would expect conditions to be a little poorer and maybe that distribution to be a little less. But it's also important to note that the conditions in 2015 are the predicted conditions to be the new normal under climate change scenarios. So you can see how much of that spawning distribution we've lost. Going from 2015 through 2018, there were similar distributions. And then here's our 2019 data, and we still see that loss of that lower distribution. After 2014, we no longer recorded any reds in that lower distribution. And we did have good returns of fish numbers through those years, so we did have the fish to disperse out there. It just doesn't seem like we're seeing suitable habitat down there. We're seeing higher temperatures. In Meacham Creek, we can see that we've got a cluster of reds right there above Line Creek, and it's actually pretty cool if you know what that cluster is. And what that cluster is that's our habitat restoration area within Meacham Creek, the same habitat restoration area that Gary was talking about in his presentation. And you can see that we've got no distribution really outside of that area, but what we've been able to create is a cold water refugia within Meacham Creek through our habitat restoration efforts, and it is being used. So Gary talked about, right there in those previous examples, we were kind of seeing how impacts from loss of habitat can affect us. Gary was talking about restoring habitat, and he showed some of our projects. And this is going to be used to kind of illustrate why that's important. So this is a stock recruitment chart for Umatilla Basin summer steelhead. The x-axis at the bottom is the returning number of adults for a certain year, and the y-axis is showing the progeny or offspring that return in following years from those adults. What we tend to see in the Umatilla Basin is that our habitat's limiting us to about 2,000 to 3,000 adult returns before we don't see any benefit in the returning progeny after this. Now, of course, like most biological systems, we see a lot of variance in that. There's a lot of variability in that, and that's why we see these dots all over. But you can see how that curve kind of peaks out and then starts to drop off. What that's telling us is that habitat's limiting our production. This could be either spawning or rearing habitat. But looking at this relationship, it appears that our rearing habitat is limiting us more than our spawning habitat. We can get a large run of adults, and they can go out and spawn throughout, but we just don't have enough area to support those rearing juveniles. If we want larger and more sustainable runs, we're going to need to increase our rearing habitat to support more juvenile survival. So restoration efforts are currently going on that's helping us to increase that suitable habitat and increase the amount of rearing and spawning habitat that we have. But how do we expand the distribution of aquatic first foods without big restoration efforts? A good thing we can do is we can reintroduce first foods into suitable habitats that already exist that are no longer being used. And so in an effort to do that, the fisheries program performed multiple assessment reports for different drainages and other subbasins within the mid-Columbia where habitat like that exists. Since we're in the Umatilla Basin, I'd like to talk a little about the Makai Creek drainage. So this is an image of the Makai Creek drainage. It's encompassed in the blue area. You can see the Umatilla River at the top of the screen. The purple denotes historical use. Now, the importance of the Makai Creek drainage is that there was a historical presence and fishery for anadromous first foods, salmon and steelhead. And because there was a lack of passage issues, there's no reason to think that we didn't have Pacific lamprey, bull trout, mussels, and other types of aquatic first foods in there. Another important reason to look at Makai Creek Basin is that for the area, the Umatilla Basin area, it encompasses roughly 23% of the red band rainbow trout. Red band rainbow and summer steelhead are synonymous. They're the same thing within the Umatilla Basin. Currently, this is 23% of the suitable habitat within the Umatilla Basin that's not being used for anadromous steelhead. Makai Creek is an opportunity to increase rearing and spawning habitat for multiple first foods. The restoration of anadromous runs of salmon and steelhead can increase harvest opportunities, and it's also going to benefit the resident fishery. Currently, there's only a resident fishery in Makai Creek, and if something were to happen within Makai Creek that severely impacted that resident fishery, it could be likely that it wouldn't have a source to return. So reestablishing anadromy to that stream allows to buffer against those kinds of catastrophic events. Also, having anadromous returns into something like Makai Creek buffers and helps mitigate against catastrophic events or poor conditions with within other drainages of the Umatilla Basin. It's also important to note that the North Fork Makai Creek property was just purchased by the CTUIR, and it's an opportunity for us to start doing some restoration within that drainage itself. So I talked a little bit about resident fisheries in Makai Creek, and I just wanted to talk again why those resident fisheries may become more important as we move into these climate change scenarios. Whoops. So initial spatial distribution and rearing habitat availability also increases the opportunity for resident fisheries. Road-known treatments in the Umatilla were performed in 1967 and 1974 and severely reduced the resident fishery. As an example of that, it wasn't uncommon before those road-known treatments to catch 18 to 20-inch whitefish, mountain whitefish. Now we're lucky to see mountain whitefish in that range. Mountain whitefish are our first food. And now if you catch one in that size, you have the difficult decision to make on whether you would like to harvest that fish or return it, because you know that's a breeding size adult. So you're limiting your harvest opportunities by not having the quantity there. Making sure that the spiritual, cultural, and health benefits of that aquatic first foods provide can be partially maintained through the access to resident fisheries. And they may become more important in the future as anadromous runs continue to fluctuate. Those low run years of anadromous returns can at least be a little bit buffered by good resident fisheries. So moving forward, what's that?
1 minute, sorry.
Thank you. So moving forward, mitigating climate change, what are some things we can do? Restoration to increase suitable habitat and stop the loss of marginal habitat. We can increase the spatial distribution into available suitable habitat. We should start looking at things like evaluating overwinter conditions for rearing juvenile salmonids. We often get stuck in this mindset of high summer water temperatures, high temperatures when we think of climate change. But it's important to note that those low flows during late winter and cold temperatures can adversely affect the survival of rearing juvenile salmonids. When the temperatures get too cold, we can see our juvenile salmonids actually starve to death with full bellies because their digestive systems are temperature driven. We also need to increase our resident aquatic first food harvest opportunities. And then we can also look at different ideas such as carcass outplanting. We can take those carcasses that come from our spawning at hatchery facilities and outplant them into habitats where we might not be able to increase the amount of habitat, but we can try to increase the quality and suitability of that habitat. And then we should also take a look at investigating known zones of low survival to try to see what the limiting factors are on those and increase the survival in those zones within our basins. So real quick, just to end, this is a short video from that restoration site up on Meacham Creek. And these are all resident red band rainbows. Now, that's not to say some of these might choose to outmigrate to the ocean, but this is one small pool within that restoration zone. And you can, if you were to count real quickly, you'd see over 20 resident rainbows or red band rainbows in here. So it's really neat to see those actions actually come to fruition. And this is just some of the literature used for this presentation. Katsiaya, thank you, and I hope that I provided something helpful.